Welcome to Wealth Without Barriers. My name is Casey Mushrush, and today I'm joined by Scott Klon, and we're here to talk to you about your money and the things that you need to do in order to ensure your future financial success. But before we get into 5 retirement myths investors often get wrong, Scott, how you been?
I've been pretty good.
Yeah. Now you were just mentioning right before we started. Well, actually, maybe we hit the record button.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It might be on there. Maybe need to edit
So
some of that stuff out. But
so your son graduated this weekend.
yeah, he graduated from College, and so I always say he's off the payroll now. But
Yeah.
it's another phase in life that we're gonna have to talk about the myths, because I've always heard the empty nester is like one of the most wonderful years, but then grandkids come along and all that other type of stuff that is even better than that. So we'll have to wait and see on all that
Oh, there
stuff.
you go. That'll be exciting to find out how that goes. So no grandkids yet. You just the grand dog, right? That's the.
I got the grand dog and Shelly, my girlfriend, and I mean we're pretty committed to each other. I mean she has a couple grandchildren, so I mean I've got partial experience, I guess you would say, but I like with my kids, and I don't know if this happens for everybody, and I treat not my own blood, but when I recognized my features in my daughter was the firstborn, it just was instant, love, because. Yeah. I recognized that she was just as ornery as her dad, and
Yeah, they have a tendency to do that to you, don't they? Those little ones. Like I still, and I guess my wife reminded me last night because somebody asked me how old Owen was. I was like, oh, he's like 5 weeks old. Oh no, he's like 8 weeks old. But it's kind of funny with that it's I still lose track of time. Like I go home and like you're just holding this little person and all that kind of thing. I try to take a nap too, but it's it just goes so quickly. Just absolutely incredible. But
I mean I think the entire raising kids.
Yeah.
You look back on it and it's like, oh, that went by really fast.
Yeah. Well, it's like I can remember our oldest, because she just turned 15 here not too long ago. Driving cars and attitude and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. But she's, I remember she being really little, and sometimes I look at her and I'm like, holy cow, you're not 2 years old anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, I still look at my kids and, they're definitely grown up, but I mean, I can still see their little kid faces, and I can remember, certain things, why they were growing up, and, plain as day still, and even when I look at them I kind of see that still, but yeah, I mean it goes by really quick, and the funny thing is like with the basketball, I mean there's been years to where I've been traveling around to different basketball games and tournaments and different things like that, and another guy that was on the College team, we were in the same school district, for high school and all that other type of stuff, so I mean we both know that we've traveled a lot for all these things, and I was like, I'm ready for it to end, but I'm gonna miss it. Yeah, it's one of those things. So, yeah.
Now I'm curious, and I did not prepare you for this, so feel free to think about this before you answer. But because you and I are in kind of a little bit different spots. Obviously, I'm on the front end as far as the kids, and you've had your youngest just graduated from college. Now, to my understanding, you've successfully launched 2 of them, at least at this point, or got all your kids launched. So what is a piece of advice that you would give somebody to say, hey, here's maybe some things to think about that would help to make sure that your kids are able to take that step, or to get them prepared maybe for later on in life?
Yeah, and I mean I think they work definitely as far as personality-wise goes, because my son, obviously he played sports in college, and I think it was in second grade, and he was being a little bit like what I was in school. If you can get an A on the test, why do you have to study? That type of thing. And so in second grade, I sat him down and talked about academic ineligibility. And I was like, eventually the schools are going to imply that rule, but I have a different rule, and you have to do your very best in school. And if you don't, then Dad will make you ineligible for the sports, and that worked. And I think there was a few reminders here and there, but I don't know what I did. To be perfectly honest, I mean, I don't think there's. I mean, it's be with the kids, remind them, of things, let them make their own mistakes every once in a while too, to do that. But I kind of look at it as maybe I was just fortunate. I don't really make the attribution that this was because of what things that I did, really. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that
you put me on the spot on that, but I mean, really, I think, I learned, what not to do as a parent. I think sometimes that's a little bit more important than, advice of, okay, well, you should do it this way, because, I mean, none of us know, none of us have training in it, and, you do the best you can, and you do it with love, and, just don't let them be the boss. You're still the one in charge until you're no longer legally responsible for them. And that's kind of how I put it with them a lot of times. I was like, you have to follow my rules until you're financially independent, or I'm no longer legally responsible for you. And that was my approach, my attitude towards some of the stuff.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Oh, I am going to mull on some of that. There's some good nuggets in there. Whether you know it or not, there's some really good information on that. So kind of moving over into our topic for today. And I kind of talked about this a little bit, but we're going to be discussing 5 retirement myths that investors often get wrong. So I think that kind of the overall preface on this, and I know you run into this at times.
Yeah.
We talk to a lot of different people, and it's sometimes they'll walk into our office and they'll say, well, I heard, and then insert some absolutely ridiculous claim.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just narrowed down over to the things we're going to be talking about today. Like, we hear a lot of really interesting things, and sometimes it's kind of like, okay, well, I'm just a little bit curious. Where did you come up from this, or where did you hear this? And oftentimes, we see, like, I call it the water cooler financial planning. Maybe it was somebody's brother's, uncle's, father's great nephew decided to do something, and so it kind of made its way over through the grapevine around the water cooler that this was the thing that needed to do. But really, when we look at overall retirement and getting ready for retirement, I mean, it is a significant financial undertaking. I mean, it is in terms of, like, you look at overall phases of life. Like, if you look at traditional retirement, you basically have 2/3 of it that you're getting ready, and then 1/3 of it that's on the back end that you are in that retirement phase. So, I mean, you're talking upwards of, anywhere between 20 and 30 years of not having a dependable paycheck in the form of employment, right? Now, maybe you have a dependable paycheck because of other things, right? Whether it's an investment portfolio, or maybe a small business income, or maybe it's something else. But really getting ready for retirement is a huge piece. So the number one thing that we have on here, you'll spend less in retirement than you did while you were working. So where does this myth come from, and how is that a myth?
I mean, I look at it as, yes, it's a myth, and I kind of go back to, and I mentioned this last week. Some of the rules of thumbs. They're generalities that are come about based off of certain assumptions. I think a lot of times, and spending less in retirement. I think the assumption is made that, okay, well, the house is going to be paid for. I've worked with many people throughout the years, and some people have their house paid for, some people don't, and they still retire and either are successful with that. I think over the years I've heard, and I don't think it exists as much anymore, but the clothing allowance. In our industry, 30, 40 years ago, everybody wore suits. And everything has gotten more casual throughout the years, and I'm in a golf outfit. This is probably a retirement outfit. But I think the focus on traveling to work, and the clothing that you have to have for a uniform, regardless of what your job is, that all could probably contribute to it. But when I was reading this, And back to the kid things, the biggest myth that I fell into and learned my lesson is when my kids were getting out of daycare. I thought I was going to have $800 a month to spend, but it gets transferred and reverted into something else, whether it was kids' activities, I can think of AAU tournaments and all that other type of stuff. That's, I'm not sure I was spending $800 a month on those activities, but, all the stuff combined, before and after school stuff, all that type of stuff, the $800 never came to our household budget to be able to spend or save.
Right. Just when it kind of shifted that spending really more than anything else. And this is and this is something Jonas has actually talked about for years. But I know one of the things that he tells clients like that are in kind of a pre-retirement phase. He says, "How much are you spending when you're not at work?" And they kind of come up with some numbers and all that kind of thing. And he's like, "Okay, so now multiply that by 3 because that's what you're doing when you're no longer at work, and those are the activities and things that you're actually engaging in." And it can create kind of some really interesting, some really interesting numbers, at least when people actually go through and they take a look at that as far as, oh my gosh, I'm actually spending that amount of money on dinners and all that kind of thing and all that. And if I want to continue the same lifestyle, and this goes exactly back to what we were talking about last week, are we trying to do that income replacement method? And I think that's probably where, at least this as a myth, it probably comes directly from that income replacement method being utilized as like a primary means of retirement planning. Take your income and then, back off, basically spend, somewhere between 60 and 80% of it because you're not going to do 401k contributions. You're not going to do those other things. You just need to, replace your current income. And it doesn't necessarily actually define anything from a lifestyle standpoint. I do think that especially right now, in today's retirement type scenarios, it's even different from when I started even a decade ago. A decade ago, I would say that it was probably a little bit more laid back. Even right now, I would say that a lot of retirees are quite a bit more active, even moving over into a retirement scenario compared to where it was. Now, maybe that's just selection bias, as far as like the people that I was working with at that point in time versus where I'm at right now. But it does seem like there's more of I think I've probably had more conversations over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, especially since COVID, of couples that are going and doing like the RV thing. Like I didn't run across that very often prior to 2020. I mean, every once in a while, here and there. I mean, it was kind of, I would say it was probably less often. And I run into that not infrequently anymore. It's been, at least in my personal experience, has been a significant tick up over on there. Now, when we say that you're going to spend less in retirement, have you gone and priced an RV?
It's a second home.
It is a second home. I mean, and so, like you look at something like that and you look at like the actual expense of taking that thing down the road. And by the time you have the parking fees and all that kind of stuff that goes over on there, I mean, maybe depending on that particular situation, they might be trying to sustain a mobile residence and then the home base, right? Yeah. So, basically it's all right, well, you're buying a second home over in retirement and then also all the maintenance and that comes along with that. And it doesn't result really in retirement savings. And if the numbers work, that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're spending less compared to when they were over in that accumulation mode.
Oh, exactly. And, I could go on and on for, the mobile home, the maintenance costs on those things are incredibly high to do that. And I mean, to each their own. I don't think I will ever, be in love with camping. That's just not something. And when I have camped, I've enjoyed it the most when I went the really cheap route and went with a tent and, you know that, okay, well, after this night or a couple of nights, I'm going to go home and take a shower and, be all better. But
camping versus glamping.
Yeah.
My wife is a glamper. It's actually been to the extent that in our marriage we've actually never gone, because if I want to go camping, I want to go camping. Exactly like what you're saying is, let's go get a tent, let's bring let's pack in the Dutch oven, let's make Dutch oven biscuits and all that kind of stuff. And she says, well, where's the bed?
Yeah. Well, and I think I enjoy going to visit somebody that camps, sit by the campfire and then go home after that.
Yeah, hang out by the campfire, eat some s'mores.
Yeah.
Yep.
Eat some s'mores or hot dogs obviously I love grilling and different things like that. So
yeah, we do that. We'll have to invite you over because we do campfires. So we're right back over into that season. But during the spring through the summer and then into early fall, we have a fire pit that we'll go kick out back. So we'll invite you over for a hot dog and a s'more one of these days.
Yeah, because we have one on our deck. It's a propane one, and it's got the cute little crystals, and
and all
that. But I think we usually go through probably a propane tank to 2 propane tanks, just on the fireplace. That's just, Saturday night or Friday night or something like that. We'll just sit out there for a couple hours. But
yeah, we're in year 5 of burning the maple trees that came down.
Oh, really?
2 maple trees that came down during trade show. I think we got maybe another 1.5 or 3 years worth of firewood, something like that.
Do you really?
We've still got just a ton over there. It's significantly less than we had, but
they must have been pretty big trees.
They were pretty massive. If it had fallen, like it was clear over the far back end of our yard, if it had fallen the wrong way, it would have crushed the house.
Oh, really?
And they were pretty good clip. Now, fortunately for us, the main damage that we had even over through the thing is we lost a trampoline, but yeah, we still wound up with quite a bit of firewood. It's well seasoned at this point. So
yeah, I bet it is.
So another myth, that we oftentimes will run across: Medicare covering all healthcare costs. And this is something that has maybe a little bit of a glimmer of truth over to it, right? But I think it probably gets pretty expanded over off that side. But we'll have people walk in and it's like, oh, I don't need to worry about anything as far as healthcare allocations or anything like that. It's all covered by Medicare. And while by and large, many, many things are, not necessarily. If you look at what Medicare is as far as the actual base program itself, it's covering it's essential coverage, right? It's covering a lot of main sort of medical things. I think there's like 100-day max on hospital visits and things like that, but they do have some carve-outs on that when it comes over to Medicare coverage. Oftentimes what we will see people do is they will have some sort of like a supplement plan that helps fill in some of those different gaps, or they may be looking at like a Medicare Advantage plan. Now, that being said, that entire marketplace has been kind of interesting to watch in the last handful of years. There's a lot of, I want to call it, lawsuit type stuff that is related into that particular marketplace has been popping up in the last handful of years. And so, it's not going to necessarily cover everything. It does cover many things, but it's not going to necessarily cover everything. And then, Lord help you if you need to go out a network or something like that, because looking at some of those different reimbursements and whatnot, it can be incredibly difficult to find, find certain types of coverage in those particular areas.
Well, and the other thing too, and I consider long-term care, part of the healthcare cost too. So Medicare definitely is not picking up the tab on that, or at least until you become on Medicaid,
right?
And then that's after you're out of money completely at that particular point in time. But
so Title 19, Medicaid, not the same as Medicare. Those are 2 different programs, and that Title 19 is a welfare program. It is for people who are at the end of their resources, at the end of their assets, whereas Medicare is a health insurance / payment program that is essentially run underneath a government / private partnership. There's kind of some weird stuff that happens over on there, but that's just because the healthcare market has been so distorted in the last. It's been the last 20 years. It's not anything recent. It's just been, it's been a very, very long period of time on that. But yeah, that Fidelity study estimates that a 65-year-old couple, now this is a couple years old, But, starting back in 2023, they were estimating somewhere around $315,000 is going to be required for healthcare and healthcare-related expenses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, over the course of a retirement. That is not insignificant. I mean, that is a pretty large chunk of time a pretty large chunk of dollars that are needed in order to cover the overall cost of healthcare.
And, the interesting thing on this, and I have not done the math, but it wasn't that long ago to where it was probably about $75,000 less. Because I can remember a 233 number, and it wasn't more than 10 years ago. It was probably five or six. So, I mean, the healthcare costs are climbing pretty rapidly.
Well, and especially if you look at, and again, I think that's probably when we look at our software, because I run healthcare modules for everybody when I'm going through and running a financial plan, and I explain to them, it's like, look, I mean, there's a couple of reasons we do this. Number one, inflation in healthcare-related costs goes up faster than normal inflation, right? So if we're running just call it like a 2.5% standard inflation rate, well, healthcare, we're going to be assuming somewhere closer to 4.5%. If we're doing 3%, okay, now we're assuming maybe closer to 5%, right? But we are assuming that healthcare costs, because historically speaking, at least over the course of the last 30, 40 years, healthcare costs have increased at a faster pace than other things that are standard out there. Now, I do think that that's kind of one of those areas where if you look at cost of living adjustments, right? This is one of the things that I think is going to be that sleight of hand that may end up coming with Social Security. What are they actually tying it to from an overall index standpoint? So, like, take, for example, with Social Security, one of the conversations that has been had in the past is adjusting the cost of living the cost of living adjustment, or changing that COLA to what it's being indexed against. Well, if they don't index it to CPI, they index it to something like CPIW, right? Well, it changes, meaning it increases at a slower pace. So it creates solvency within that program because they're not tying it over to a different index. The CPIE, or the CPI for elder care and things like that. That particular index is what we see happening or increasing significantly faster than a lot of other areas when it comes over to inflation or inflationary costs.
And I think that I find that interesting because, I mean, I think retirement, it's such there's the three phases of it. And, I don't want to overuse the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. But, I think inflation doesn't impact retirees so much when they're not doing much, but yet they're still healthy. But when they are in the go-go years and traveling a lot, well, then inflation probably does kick in quite a bit, and then especially when it comes over to healthcare. So, the fact that there are three phases of retirement for most people,
right?
It's a little bit different, and it makes it difficult to plan for. Okay, well, what is the inflation rate on this? So
well, it's kind of, I think it's a JP Morgan piece actually that they'd put out in their guide to retirement. And they have kind of, you look at overall spending, it's kind of U-shaped a little bit, exactly for that reason that you're talking about. Like, we're all active, things are really going good, we're having a lot of fun. Then we start to stay home a little bit, and then healthcare creeps up, right? So we have almost this little bit of a, it's a little bit more like a U-shape, at least over in terms of that overall spending, at least in terms of just pure actual output or inflation adjusted dollars. But again, if you look at where a lot of those healthcare costs end up, it's pretty typically a lot of the healthcare expenses really come in about the last 5 years of life. That is where the primary parts of healthcare or the expenses, and to your point, long-term care being a part of that. Somebody needs 3 years of long-term care. I mean, right there, you're looking at $300,000, depending. Well, I mean, it depends on what part of the country that you're in. Maybe more, maybe a little bit less, but
probably more. I mean,
I want to say the average in like the state of Iowa was like somewhere between 100 to 119,000 right now. If you're looking at like private nursing home care, on like a private room. Obviously, if you're doing like a shared room or something like that, and that's kind of where this gets a little bit more.
Yeah, it gets hairy.
It gets a little bit more. It kind of depends on the circumstances, because if you're not in a private room, right? Meaning that you have like some shared spaces and you've got some stuff like that, then it's going to cost a little bit less compared to somebody who is, that is in a fully private, care facility or care type situation. So, consumer choices actually does have, and what I mean by that is the choices that an individual makes as far as how they're going to be engaging over through their care is going to have an impact on what this overall cost is. So we can put out some estimates and things like that. Your situation is definitely going to be different. And what we have to do, especially when it comes over to the financial planning context, we have to take that into consideration, right? Are we planning on, all the bells and whistles, or are you coming to me and saying, you know what? I'm less concerned about that. I just want to make sure that I have actually access to the skilled care that I need. I don't care if we're in a, in some sort of a, facility where I'm not by myself constantly. Maybe my personal space isn't quite as important, but maybe it is. I don't know. That's kind of one of those fun things that there's a discussion to be had about it.
Well, and I've experienced some, long-term care planning, and the thing of it is that there's just way too many options to cover it, and it's gotten a little bit less complicated because the long-term care companies underpriced it for so many years, and so they got rid of the unlimited policies for the most part and all that type of stuff. But it's still difficult because you have no idea what's going to happen for sure. You can end up paying, and it's a use it or lose it concept. You can end up paying for a long-term care insurance policy and then die quickly of a sudden massive heart attack, and all that premium dollars, depending on what type of policy you end up buying, could go to waste, or it goes to the pool that they do that. So I think with that, some of the best approaches is okay. Well, what would destitute somebody? Because we can show that, but what do you want to earmark of your retirement dollars, to be set aside for long-term care? So
no, and it's definitely and again, I think that the medical costs. Really kind of to summarize what we were talking about, like the medical cost is a major component that we need to be thinking about, right? Now, we don't know exactly what it's going to be. Like that's impossible to have absolute prediction on what that is on any household. But we want to make sure that we've got some sort of an allocation. And we also recognize, and we have to recognize that spending has a tendency to shift, right? What might be allocated over toward one thing today is probably going to get allocated over to something else tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go away, right? It means that it might be shifting that allocation over to somewhere else.
Yeah, because if you retire on, let's just say $10,000 a month, which I think is probably a fairly healthy retirement, all of a sudden you need long-term care. Even if it's in home, you're probably not having the lifestyle where you're still spending $10,000 a month. So that shift in cost is probably gonna go to the care. So you're self-funding a little bit in that regard.
Well, and I think that gets over to like, how do you solve that problem, right? Like when I first came into the industry over in doing insurance sales, well, let's face it, that's what I was doing, right? Or I was attempting to do. But like the way that I was taught over on that is, okay, well, you go sell for the need. Like how much, if it's going to be $10,000, you go sell a policy that's going to pay $10,000 a month. And so you try to cover that entire need. And as I kind of progress throughout my career, it's like, well, maybe we don't need to cover that full amount, right? Because if we have other sources of income that we have a pretty high level of confidence that they're going to be there, whether it's something like Social Security or whether it's like maybe some other form of income. Now we're doing gap planning, right? Maybe I don't need to cover the full $10,000 a month that a at-home hair cost, or like some sort of a care facility cost or something like that. Maybe we're trying to solve for $4,000 a month or $5,000 a month or $2,000 a month, depending on the way that overall set of income or the way those that income sources were set up. What I always find really kind of interesting on that is sometimes I'll run into people who are very lopsided in terms of their cash flow, and what I mean by that. Maybe prior to sitting down and talking to us, they've made some irrevocable decisions, right? They took a pension at 100%, with no survivor benefit or something like that. Maybe they did that with maybe annuitizing another, like an insurance contract or something like that. And they've basically done some things where one spouse is actually receiving, at least in terms of like those overall tax numbers, those tax ID numbers. One spouse is getting all the income, but the other one doesn't have anything. And so maybe there's a little bit of a gap on that side that might be like, okay, well, you're actually fine as long as you're around, but we're actually planning in case you're gone, right? So in that particular instance, we're doing a lot of, I would say it's the second spouse or the survivor spouse planning more so than anything else in that particular scenario.
Yeah, and I always kind of view it as the insurance piece of this equation is really to prevent the catastrophe. It's not necessarily to pay for everything.
Right.
But it's the way, and I'm talking Medicaid with that. I think we kind of turned this into a different subject a little bit, but
quite all right.
but I mean, the surviving spouse does have the ability to keep some assets. It's not a high amount, but they have some ability to keep.
And it varies by state. I mean, that's the challenge on that. It also varies by some different states. It depends on the way the titling is done. And what I mean by that is there are states where you can qualify a institutional spouse apart from a community spouse if all of the IRAs or the retirement assets are in that community spouse's name. Whereas in other states, like take, for example, Iowa and Minnesota and several of them throughout the Midwest, it's pooled assets.
Yeah.
They don't care who actually the owner is. They care about total assets.
Right. And I guess I really haven't done much planning outside of that particular rule, but I mean, it's one of those deals where if the client knows that, okay, well, if so-and-so does go to a nursing home, this is what you're going to get left. You're going to have to spend down to this amount. And are you able to live out your remaining years with that? And then what do we have to cover from there? So there's a lot of different ways that we can approach it. And it's really, I mean, the whole life insurance and long-term care and all that's not necessarily always planning for the person that might be going through it. It's planning for the survivor.
Right. Yep. Oh, absolutely. So this is something that I know, as far as a myth that I run into not infrequently, and I'm sure you do not either, but your retirement savings should be conservative. Put everything in cash, Scott. Everything needs to go to cash.
Yeah, I mean, game over. Retirement and put everything into cash. But the fact of the matter is if you're retiring at 65, I mean, odds are that you're going to live another 20 years.
You're right.
And that's proven over and over again. And I still go back to, and I'm baffled by this, but I mean, I've heard some human biologists type of say is that the person that's going to live to 150 has been born.
Yeah.
So, it's 65 to 150. That's a lot of years.
That is a very long time.
And so, I mean, should we be pushing the retirement age back if you're pretty healthy by the time you turn 65? But, that there is if you're going to keep pace with inflation, obviously the cash yields are usually less than what inflation is. There's a few instances here and there that we might be earning more on our savings account than what inflation rates are, but I can't think of very many. So your money needs to outpace that inflation rate. So I would say that approaching retirement, don't schedule an appointment with the advisor, a month before you're planning on retiring and saying, okay, well, I need to do something with my 401k now. I mean, we probably should be, moving and allocating assets a little bit differently than how you were accumulating it, just so we can get into retirement. Because, I was around in 2008 in the business, and I had some retirees retire in 2008, and that was scary if you didn't have the right plan in place, because if your portfolio was down 50%, obviously it wasn't down that much, but the market was down that much.
When all the noise, everything around you is screaming.
Yeah, so like a year into retirement, if you didn't plan it right, you could be going back to work.
Right.
Just simply because there were some big losses during that time frame.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, this particular myth, I think it has root in the idea that retirement is a date and not a season, right?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, when we take a look at it, you kind of mentioned this already earlier, retirement as a season might be a 20 or 25 or a 30-year period of time, right? So, if I said to you that I've got a 30-year time horizon for an investment portfolio, and I want to put everything over into cash, well, that's not really an investment portfolio at that point in time. I mean, it's a savings account. And I don't know that is going to give us, again, to your point, the rate of return that would be necessary for us to try and preserve those assets, if that's actually what our overall goal is, especially by the way that inflation works at that point in time, over, again, that 20 or 30 years. So, So I think that especially when we look over at those conservative, and well, again, this goes back over to when we sit down and talk about our clients, it really goes back to the idea of risk capacity. I have talked to some clients, especially given the most recent context of things over on the market, where they're nervous, and I get it. I mean, I fully understand because of the volatility that we've seen here relatively recently. But if we go through and we take a look over at that financial plan, and the financial plan tells us that we are actually taking more risk by being overly conservative, we're less likely to reach our future spending goals. There's more risk to that portfolio. There's more risk in that plan compared to maybe one that has more volatility or more up and down market movement. But we are statistically more likely to be able to hit those future spending goals. And so by introducing risk capacity into the conversation, not risk tolerance, right? I think that entire idea is just I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, we've talked about this. The questionnaires, and that's the only way that the questionnaires, how do you answer this question? Right. And, and I've done that with people because I've visited, retirement plans, to sponsors, and I'll have them take a sheet, and then they have come back to me to work with me, and we do that same sheet. And I saved the ones that we did at the employer site versus that, and they were two completely different.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was like a score of 35 was the maximum that you could get, and this person got a 34 and a 28. And so I was like, okay, so what changed from there? Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
but
about 10 minutes.
Well, it was a couple weeks, but.
Well, but again, I just when we try to eliminate that human bias, right? Because that's emotional bias that is bringing over in these results like that. And if we can eliminate that as much as possible, we want to allow our portfolios really to be driven by the financial plan rather than be driven by how I'm feeling today or how you're feeling today or how anybody is really reacting from an emotional standpoint. And again, this isn't to say that you can't validate those emotions, right? I do think it's important to recognize that, things are uncomfortable right now. Like, we can do that. And I'll give you a really good example of this. So when Owen, I think I've talked about this before, when Owen came back from the hospital, like, he was in the NICU, and we left the hospital without him. That was weird. Like, I did not like that at all. I told my wife driving down the road, I was like, I'm having an emotional reaction right now because here I am. I got you in the seat behind you. I've got all the other kids over in the back of the car, and we don't have our baby. Like, he's not with us right now. Now, logically, he was in the hospital. He was surrounded by an entire team of nurses and doctors that were dedicated to taking care of him. There was no better place for him to be. Right. There was absolutely no better place for him to be. And I was still having this just gut-wrenching, terrible emotional reaction as we were heading away from the hospital on that, because it was something we'd never had to do before. I never want to repeat it.
Right.
And B, it was solely based on how I felt, not based off what the actual objective reality of the situation was. He was in way better care at the hospital than he would have been if he was coming home with us. Not what I wanted. Not what I thought should have been happening, not how I thought things should have been going. And so we have to be able to validate those emotions, especially when we have these times of chaos, and recognize that it is okay to feel that way. It is perfectly fine. We are emotional creatures. We are human beings. We have emotions. That doesn't necessarily mean that the right thing would have been for me to drive back to the hospital and go pick him up and run out the door.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I get that. I mean, I think I would have the same emotion because, I mean, I think my kids were in the hospital twice when there, and I slept with them both times. You know, it was one of those things where I couldn't go home.
Yeah.
And you know, even though it was, you're right, it was the best place for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, and I still remember. And I look back on it, and it was a fun time with my daughter. The one time, because she was 3 years old, or not even. No, she wasn't even that. Yeah, what was she? About 18 months or so. And picked up, I think was RSV, but they didn't test for it because it was too early in the season, which didn't make sense to me. But you know, she kept walking around that crib with a little sensor thing on her toe, and it kept just beeping, and you know, have to go over and put it on. But you know, in the middle of the night, I'm not sure what my point is with all this, but it's a cute story.
Yeah.
You know, she's in the crib looking like she's in jail and going da da. So yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from. I mean, it's just it's hard to leave your kids in the hospital or, have them be in the hospital at all. I mean, I hated it when they were sick, just because you can't do anything for them. Really.
It's that lack of control. It's the emotional reaction more than it is anything else. And I see the parallels on it when, we sit down and we look at the overall macro environment. So take, for example, policy decisions, right? Whether it comes over in trade policy or whether it comes over to, employment policy, even at the federal level, the vast majority of us really don't have a say in that. Now, we can certainly go to the ballot box and we can vote and we can actually try to push, specific policies, forward over on that. But at the end of the day, we do not sit over and vote on every single piece of legislation that comes its way over through the halls of Congress.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
According to Facebook, I thought we had all sorts of control.
Well, I tell you what, Ashley has not yet given me a phone call to ask me my opinion on anything. I'm more than willing to give it.
Well, I know, but I was just thinking, with all the political posts that are going on social media right now, I thought for sure we had to say.
Yeah, well, and again, I think that it's the day-to-day, the robustness of the system is the day-to-day is not driven by the masses. I do think that's a feature, not a bug, in my opinion, but. No, it is. I do think that, along with that, I mean, it really gets over to the fact that we don't have a whole lot of control over those things, especially when it comes over to the markets, when it comes over to returns. We can't control returns. Now, I can control how I'm going to react to it, right? I can control what my asset allocation is. I can control whether or not I panic and move everything over into cash, or, I allow the plan to really help guide me forward and to make a change if it is warranted. This is no different than it was back in COVID. Like I had plenty of clients even during COVID times that, we had that flash crash basically.
Yeah.
They said, hey, where are we sitting at right now? We pull up the plan. It's like, okay, well, like all this stuff and all the turmoil, you went from an 87% probability to an 82. That's statistically significant, right? That actually is a drop. Okay, well, what if we change the portfolio to cash? Clicking a couple of different buttons and all that kind of thing. Okay, well, that 82% probability just went to a 62.
Yeah.
So you tell me, should we actually do this or not? Yeah, probably not. That actually significantly harms our ability to create future income, doesn't it? Yes, that's exactly what we're looking at there. And so in that particular instance, it allows that plan really to eliminate all that emotional bias that we drag over into it. You can still feel them. I'm not saying don't feel emotions. I'm saying that allow the financial plan really to help guide those decisions rather than having a knee-jerk reaction just because I don't like the particular political environment or I'm excited about the political environment, right? Both of those are emotional reactions.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think I've had more than 5 conversations about the allocation strategy that we're actually using, especially for those that are actually drawing income. Mm-hmm. And, it's just a reminder that, okay, well, we do have our growth assets and we have, our cash assets that don't necessarily get impacted by the market fluctuations. And, we can live another, so many months on this before we would even have to touch any of this. And, for the most part, I mean, everybody's walked away from that pretty good, but they're still concerned about the market. I mean, because you don't like to see drops in your net worth, and I get that. I mean, I don't want to see it either, but it's one of those things where you kind of got to look at the big picture of, okay, well, is this market volatility, is this permanent?
Right.
And if it does drop 30% or whatever it drops to, is it going to stay that way? No, it probably isn't. I mean, and if it does, then we have a whole lot more issues than just your retirement plan, probably.
Well, kind of over to that next one, kind of the fourth one on our list here. You can't afford to hire a financial advisor. Financial advisors are too expensive.
I'm a little biased when it comes to that, but it's, in my opinion, it goes right back to what we were just talking about. Yeah. We are going to add the emotion-free advice because it's, in most cases, I mean, we have our, worries and concerns and stuff like that, but when we're not dealing with our own situation, we can remind people that, okay, you're making an emotional decision here. So, some of the facts are this. And so, it just, can we afford not to hire a financial advisor? And, the big things is it's hiring someone for the situations that you don't know. And, I'm not perfect as an advisor. I don't know if there is a perfect one out there, but, we're going to run across things working 40 hours a week. Say that the ordinary person isn't going to, because they're involved and they specialize in something different than what we do, and that's just it. I mean, I don't think it's a matter of capabilities. I mean, I probably have the capabilities to learn how to fix my car, but I don't have the time, knowledge, or desire.
Right.
To do that, and that's where the professional help comes into play.
Yeah. Well, and I think exactly what you mentioned on there, like the deciding whether or not to hire a financial advisor, it goes right back over to that time, knowledge, or desire. Right. If you have all three of those things, you don't need an advisor.
Yeah.
If you have the time, you have the knowledge, you have the desire, then absolutely, like you don't need us. Like that's pretty simple. If you're lacking in one of those areas, that's where you go seek some sort of professional help. And I don't care whether that's financial advising, if it's true in the legal world, if it's true over in the tax world, it's true in the medical world, it's true in the vehicle world, right? That's really kind of that overall decision or that decision matrix as far as whether or not you should be going and hiring stuff out. So, and I'll give you a really good example. Like I talked about that 80-year-old Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, best car we ever owned, ever. One of the things I absolutely loved about that car is I could actually work on it. Like it was great. Like you could actually get your hands down into it. You could change things out. Like I changed my own oil back when we owned that thing and all that. Now part of that actually was monetary driven too. I also had quite a bit more time on my hands. Like I don't change the oil in my car anymore.
Yeah,
I could do it. Like I know how to. I don't do it because I don't want to take the time out of my day to do that. It's a lot simpler and easier for me to have that go down over to the shop, continue to remain back over here, and then go pick it up later. Whereas if I had to do it myself, it would be a lot less expensive. But my time is a lot more valuable to me compared to where it was when I first moved here to town. So, that's kind of the overall decision matrix, I think, on that side. Now, one of the other pieces that I think is always really interesting is the Vanguard actually publishes a value of advice study. And I can't remember the last one that I saw. I think it's been a couple of years since I've seen one of these. But like some of the versions that they've had out there, and now they're actually one of the more conservative ones. Russell Investments actually does one where they say the value of advice is close to 4%.
Right.
The Vanguard one is a little bit more conservative. It says about 3% on a per year basis. Now, if you actually look at the way that they break that down, so the investment selection, like picking out the investments, they say somewhere between 0 to 0.25%. That's actually the value of it. So when you sit down, you actually hire a financial advisor, somebody who is engaging throughout this process, like with what we do. It's not because of the investment selection. In terms of like things that are available, we all have access to about the same stuff. There's a handful of companies that are out there that might have some captive investments or something like that. But by and large, if I go buy an S&P 500 fund and it's at Vanguard, or I go buy an S&P 500 fund at State Street, or I go buy an S&P 500 fund over at BlackRock, or I go buy an S&P 500 fund over at any other company, I own the S&P 500. Where it's actually located may not necessarily matter quite so much. But when you look at that study, the major contribution, right, that actually came into advisors assisting their clients for long-term outperformance compared to their peers is behavior coaching and behavior management.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with investments, had nothing to do with taxes, but it was, here is the appropriate asset allocation. And then we stick with it over a multi-year period of time or over a very long period of time. And then we put those emotional guardrails in place in order to allow our decisions actually to be decisions that put us into a better position rather than a knee-jerk reaction. And that's one of those things that it's always been kind of staggering to me that was, according to the biggest indexers, the pioneers of indexing and low-cost investments are like, the investments actually don't matter nearly as much as the behavioral management when it comes over to the financial planning process itself.
Yeah, and I mean, on a daily basis, especially during times like this, right, it doesn't become more true because, I've had conversations on, stick to it, be consistent, don't stop your investing just because we got some volatility going on, and that's the behavioral management of it. And the crystal ball that I keep under my desk, it works sometimes, and other times it's just a little cloudy.
Oh yeah, yours actually came in. I always joke mine's still in the mail.
Yeah, well, it was actually a little golf snowblow right.
Oh, so the last thing, Scott, and I'll probably let you talk a little bit more about this, just because you're kind of definitely in this phase. But the last myth that we have that we were going to address is you should help your adult children.
Well, the funny thing is I have an 8:30 Zoom call with my daughter because she sent me a text the other day that basically said, "Which one do I pick?" And it was her 401k election because she just started a new job. I think it was like 2 weeks ago. So she's now enrolling in her 401k. So, I taught her that aspect of it. And I've mentioned, I think before in the past, my daughter is she's very good at spending other people's money. But spending her own money, she knows exactly what is in her checking and savings account at her bank, probably to the penny if we called her up right now. Yeah. But, so she's doing that. So I don't think this is the track that we're on, but it is back to raising your child throughout the years and age appropriate lessons to do things to make sure that when they do get to adulthood, they're able to perform on their own. Right. So we don't have to go back and help them. And we're all raised a little bit differently. My philosophy was, I'm going to help them out financially while they're with me, but I'm not giving stuff away. And I had to mow lawns for my first moped. Then I sold my moped and bought a car, and all that. And it was all based off of lawn mowing money. And that just happened to be my part-time job as a teenager, just because I was in a lot of sports and I had to be flexible on the time. I couldn't work a job to where I had to be there at a certain time. But, provide their needs, but their wants, you got to teach them, save birthday money, or, go work for it, or whatever it is, you need to do that. So, with job losses and all that other type of stuff, especially when they're first starting out, because, quite frankly, I mean, people don't start out life with 6 months emergency reserves to cover them for job losses and all that other type of stuff. But, so yeah, they can live with me if they need to. I haven't had to have that happen yet, but they could. But when they move in, what's the plan?
Right.
We have to have a plan to rectify this situation, because I didn't raise you to live here the rest of your life. So that's all.
Well, and I think it sounds like with what you're talking about on that, it's important to establish boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. You have those boundaries put over into place, and then you stick with them over time. I mean, when we look at it over through the retirement context, it's not to say don't give your kids money, right? That's not necessarily what we're saying here. But if you're creating or fostering some sort of an environment or some sort of a inability for yourself to remain retired, that can become problematic at that point in time, right? Yeah. And I think that helping your kids with money can take a couple of different routes. There's kind of like the things that you're talking about, which is, hey, we've got some sort of a crisis that's going on, and we're going to assist over through a crisis, like crisis management. And I see absolutely no issues on that. But if I'm sending my, if my income is $3,000 a month, and I'm sending my kid $2,500 a month, that can potentially be a little bit of a problem. Now, again, I do think that there is this idea that if you are blessed and you can do so, warm hand giving is a wonderful, wonderful thing, but we don't want to do it in a way that ends up financially harming the people who are maybe in retirement, or maybe have lesser of an ability to go out and earn wages or earn a living to be able to create some of that different gap filling.
Well, on the flip side of that, I mean, is that financially harming the child that's the recipient of the money too? Because I mean, I think our job as parents is to teach our kids to live independently. Now, if I'm well off, and let's just say I win $100,000 in the Powerball for some reason, I stopped at a convenience store and actually bought a ticket.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't lately, but if I did that, then it's a situation to where, okay, well, that's not going to dry up anytime soon if I'm giving them $2,500 a month,
right?
And so they don't need to, figure out, okay, well, what happens when that's gone to do that. If I'm making any sense there, because
because I mean, really, what you're saying is that even if we are, we're helping our kids, we want it to be a blessing. We don't want it to morph into a curse. And I think that maybe that's something that I know I've seen happen before in the past. Like, I've run into that, usually surrounding inheritances. If you look at the average inheritance, it's spent within 2 years. Like, that's just kind of on average. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was squandered. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying there. But in general, about a 2-year period of time before inheritances are actually spent in one way, shape, or form is usually that's the national average on there. Sometimes it's done in a way that is incredibly helpful for a family situations, and other times it's just additional consumption.
Right.
Now, I guess I don't make a judgment on which is correct or which is not. At the end of the day, that is a decision that for that individual and for that household. But it is something that we want to make sure that you're not jeopardizing yourself or jeopardizing your future retirement just out of this filial obligation, if you will, because I'm worried about my kids or worried about them. Like, to your point, I do think it is important that they are able to stand on their own feet. That's not to say you can't help them out periodically. It's just don't jeopardize yourself during that process as you go through.
And I mean, I do think that it's a lifelong lesson. I mean, you know, your new baby, maybe not so many lessons, but you know,
I don't know. We were talking about Roth IRAs the other night, so.
Were you? Okay. Well, his name was almost Roth.
that was the general consensus in the office. We should name him Roth.
Mm-hmm. At least a mental name, I guess.
Oh, so if you're looking for any sort of financial help with this or any other aspect of your financial life, feel free to reach out to Scott or I at contact@premieriwm.com, or you can call us at 1-800-383-6590. Simply ask for Scott or Case, and we'd be more than willing to help talk to you. So we do offer a free initial consultation. You can actually go find the link within the description below, or you can email us at that contact@premieriwm.com, and we will make sure we get that out to you. Follow us for more Wealth Without Barriers content, and with that, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Scott, good to see you.
Yep, good to see you. Yep.
Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Premier Investments and Wealth Management and LPL Financial do not provide tax advice. Please consult your tax professional. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. There's no guarantee that a diversified portfolio will enhance overall returns or outperform a non-diversified portfolio. Diversification does not protect against market risk. All performance referenced is historical and is not a guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal.